Hi everyone, this is Lee. I got some comments asking how I made the elevation map for my latest project, and in this video I intend to provide some answers. The process of rendering Aram's surface was a pretty messy one that involved a lot of experimentation and making corrections to the sometimes implausible or otherwise disappointing results. Just a constantly reworked canvas of a thing. So attempting to provide the full sequence of steps would be almost impossible for me and potentially still not very helpful to you. What I'll do instead is make a tutorial out of a completely new map in Photopea, demonstrating only some of the methods I used rather than the whole accumulation of success and paintovers of failures. Here goes. Now, suppose you've worked out a tectonic history sequence that produces this layout, with a fuchsia plate having recently diverged from this brown plate, and a teal plate converging on both of them such that their oceanic crust subducts beneath it, and the fuchsia's continental crust joins to it. Given this arrangement, we'll begin by setting this plate layer to color, and then creating a base layer, filled in with the shade of gray corresponding to the average oceanic crust depth, which on Earth is about 3,682 meters below sea level. The elevation chart I used for the Aram project has a minimum value of 10,750 meters below sea level and a maximum value of 9,250 meters above, and so that oceanic average looks to rest about here on the chart. Next, we'll select our continental crust with the magic wand tool set to Unite, and fill it with a value just below that of sea level here. And then I'll borrow a gradient map adjustment layer that I used for another project, and copy it into the mapmaking project file just above the base layer. I'll have to do a little explainer for that too at some point, I think. Anyways, next I use the magic wand tool set to Unite once again, but now with a 15 pixel feather and 60% tolerance, and give the teal plate a few clicks. Then I set the feather back to 0 and use the subtract function, and click the teal plate one last time and also subtract the fuchsia's continental crust from this selection with a 10% tolerance. I then go to the base layer and darken that selected portion with threshold, and we now have a semblance of a convergent oceanic trench. Then I use the magic wand tool with a feather of about 8 pixels, a tolerance of 60% once again, and set to intersect this time, and click on the teal plate about 4 times so we have a selection that's pulled back from the margin a bit. I then use the dodge tool set to a lower exposure and sort of scribble in near that edge, simulating an island arc uplifted by the subduction of the other plates. At this point, we can also raise some of this continental crust above the water by using the brush tool with a value corresponding to the average dry elevation, which on Earth is about 840 meters above sea level. This we can color in sort of arbitrarily, but remember that terrain tends to be higher and somewhat straighter along a continent's leading margin, and can be a bit lower and more messy looking along its trailing margin. Rendering the bathymetry of diverging oceanic crust is a bit more challenging, and I've used a variety of methods to go about it in the past, but this time what we're going to do is create a new layer and use the gradient tool with the average oceanic crust depth color on either side and the submerged continental shelf color in the middle, toggling these little 50% sliders so that they sit at 10 degrees from it on either side at 0% smoothness. Then we take the tool and drag it from the edge of this continental shelf to the roughly corresponding edge of this continental shelf, which should be a diagonal line of about 40 degrees. And then we click and drag this new layer so the pale line in the middle sits on top of the longest straight segment of the divergent boundary. Then we create a raster mask for this layer, invert it so that it's black, and then use the brush tool set to this square brush, rotated 40 degrees clockwise, and create a straight line in white that conforms to this segment of the boundary and extends from one continental shelf edge to the other. We then apply the raster mask, make a selection around this stripe, and copy-paste this selection so the stripe exists as a single movable object. Delete the layer we copied this from, and then we use the Loquify filter to give this shape a gentle S curve. We can then duplicate this curved gradient shape and place its pale line on top of the adjacent segment of the boundary, repeating this process until all boundary segments are covered with copies of this line that conform to their respective widths because of how they overlap. This will be a bit tedious and labor-intensive, invariably. Because tectonic plates have a way of meandering and rotating somewhat over the course of drifting apart, they produce a sort of wobbly, curved set of fracture zones, also known as passive transform margins, instead of neat straight lines that would be easier to render all at once, alas for us. As you can see, each stripe constitutes its own layer, so now that they're all in place, we'll return them to full opacity and merge them into one layer. We now go back to the color layer, use the magic wand on the fuchsia and brown plates, invert this selection, and then return to the fracture zones layer and delete the overhang. A divergent zone is still subject to the forces of subduction, so we'll create a raster mask and slowly reveal the trench we established earlier, using a soft brush to produce a more gradual transition from high to low bathymetry. Once this is done, we can go down to the base layer and extend the continental shelves to the edges of this block of fracture zones, and then merge these two layers together. Where the plates are actively diverging, there's usually a little gap right between the highest ridges of crust, so we'll render that by selecting our two plates, duplicating them twice, blurring the top duplicate by about 1.5 pixels, setting this blurred layer style to divide, merging it with the unblurred layer beneath it, and hiding the transform faults by painting them white. Then this layer is set to multiply, its opacity is lowered, we desaturate this layer under Image Adjustments, and before we merge this with the grayscale base layer, we'll just go in and make sure to get rid of the dark lines that aren't part of the divergent boundary. From here, I use a bunch of different tools to add more detail to the elevation and bathymetry, the first of which is the dodge tool. I used this to create the island arc at the hill plate's margin earlier, and this time it'll create scattered sea mounts on the oceanic crust and mountain ranges on the colliding margins of the continents. With my stylus, I can control the size of the brush to create smaller or larger brush strokes, depending on what I'm trying to establish. And once the sort of general layout is settled in, we can use the smudge tool to render it further. For this stage, I like this tool to be set to a higher strength, something like 80%, having the pressure-based size control turned on, the brush size set to about 20, and while we could use a sort of round, blurry brush, I kind of like using a rotated square brush, like what we painted the fracture zone stripe with. It leaves this sort of rough trail behind it that adds some nice flavor, I think. We can smear some of these sea mounts around and then go into Edit, Fade to bring back some of the original version, letting ourselves have a little bit of both. We'll work on the edges of the continental shelves with this too. There should be a variety of slopes here instead of a perfectly clean drop-off. I also use this tool to simulate erosion of the mountain ranges, starting in an area of lower elevation and then pushing that into the range itself to kind of carve out the rivers. You can also render the rivers using the brush tool, set to the continental shelf color at a low flow rate. It kind of just depends on whether you want to push things around or make clean lines. We can also use the burn tool, or a brush colored with something closer to black, to depress certain areas of the oceanic crust. New oceanic crust, whether created by rifting or by volcanic activity, is sort of low density and relatively light, so it rises closer to sea level and sometimes even surpasses it. But as it ages, it becomes denser, heavier, and thinner, and so it tends to sink even where it isn't being subducted. We can probably darken a wider range around the subduction zone, speaking of which, and depress some parts of the teal plate's oceanic interior. After a little better than an hour of work on my part, and hopefully less than 10 minutes of watching on yours, what we have here is still far from a finished render. I could take weeks sort of reworking and adjusting the map in granular detail to achieve something that approaches realism, but this does simulate my workflow pretty well, so I'll leave y'all with this. I'm pretty inexperienced with any kind of video making, but I hope this was legible, and I hope to have the time and motivation to show my work for other aspects of my map making in this medium at some future date. Bye now.